The day Naomi Dalton rode into Caldwell Creek with a surveyor's map rolled under her arm and fury in her dark eyes, every man on the main street had the good sense to step aside. It was the spring of 1882, and the Kansas plains were burning gold under a relentless April sun. Caldwell Creek sat at the edge of the Chicaskia River Basin, a town young enough that its paint was still peeling from the lumber and old enough that the men who ran it had already decided who mattered and who did not. The answer to that question, as far as the town council was concerned, had always been simple. The ones with the most land and the most water decided the shape of everything else. And for 2 years running, that man had been Cornelius Reed. Naomi pulled her chestnut mare to a stop in front of the land office and swung down from the saddle with the kind of ease that told anyone watching she had been riding since before she could properly read. She was 28 years old, with brown skin burnished by the Kansas sun and black hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. She wore a practical cotton blouse the color of creek water, a split riding skirt, and boots that were dusty from the 30-mile ride from her father's farm. She was not beautiful in the way that the dime novels described beautiful women, all pale and trembling. She was better than that. She was the kind of woman whose face you watched because it told you exactly what she was thinking and exactly how much trouble you were in. She pushed open the door of the land office without knocking. Inside, a thin man named Gerald Oakes sat behind a desk stacked with ledgers and smelling of tobacco and old paper. He looked up at her with the mild alarm of a man who had not expected the morning to be interesting. "I need to speak with whoever authorized the diversion of Ridley Creek," Naomi said, placing the surveyor's map flat on his desk with a decisive slap. Because according to this survey, dated 1879, the creek runs through the eastern quarter of the Dalton homestead before it reaches Reed land, and for the past 6 weeks, not a single drop of that water has reached our fields. Gerald Oakes removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, which was his way of buying time. "Miss Dalton," he began. "Mrs. Dalton," she corrected, though the correction came with a brief shadow across her face. Her husband Thomas had died of fever the previous autumn, leaving her alone on the homestead with a 9-year-old daughter named Clara and 200 acres of increasingly parched land. "My late husband filed those water rights in 1877. They are registered in this office. I have seen the records myself." "The records are somewhat complicated," Gerald said carefully. "Water rights are not complicated, Mr. Oakes. Water flows downhill. Prior appropriation is the law in this territory. I was here first." She tapped the map. "Tell me where I need to go to fix this." Gerald sighed and looked at his hands. "You need to speak with Cornelius Reed." Naomi straightened and looked at him steadily. "Then tell me where to find Cornelius Reed." The Reed Ranch sat 4 miles south of Caldwell Creek, on a broad rise of land that gave it a clear view of the river valley below. It was an impressive property by any measure, with a main house built from actual milled timber rather than sod, a barn large enough to house 20 horses, and fields of winter wheat that had come in green and strong because, as Naomi now understood with cold clarity, they had been drinking her water. She rode up the long drive with her spine straight and her jaw set. The ranch hands who saw her coming paused in their work to watch. One of them, a young man with sunburned ears, actually took off his hat, though whether in courtesy or surprise was difficult to say. She tied her mare at the post near the front steps and knocked on the door. A housekeeper answered, a stout woman named Mrs. Garza with kind eyes and flour on her apron. Naomi asked for Mr. Reed. Mrs. Garza studied her for a moment with an expression that mixed sympathy with something that looked like faint apology, then asked her to wait on the porch. Naomi did not sit. She stood at the porch railing and looked out over the reed land and breathed slowly, organizing her arguments in her mind the way her father had taught her, from the strongest to the strongest, because you led with the best you had and you did not stop. She heard the door open behind her and turned around. Cornelius Reed was not what she had expected. She had expected older, maybe 60, maybe fat, the kind of man who had gotten large on the labor of other people. What she got instead was a man of perhaps 33 or 34, tall and lean, with the kind of face that the Kansas wind had worked on honestly, tanned and fine-lined at the corners of his gray eyes. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving, and he was carrying a coffee cup in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other, and he looked like a man who had been working since before sunrise and had not stopped yet. He wore a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, canvas trousers, and boots with actual dirt on them, which told Naomi at least that he worked his own land rather than merely owning it. He stopped when he saw her, and something moved through his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite the polite blankness she had been braced for. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has arrived unexpectedly and is not yet sure whether it is a problem or a solution. "Mrs. Dalton," he said. His voice was low and careful, with the flat vowels of someone who had grown up in the Kansas territory rather than arrived from somewhere more refined. "You know who I am," she said. "Gerald Oakes sent a boy ahead with a note." He held up the folded paper briefly and then set it and the coffee cup down on the porch rail. "Please come inside. It is too hot to argue on the porch." "I am not arguing," she said. "I am stating facts." "Then please come inside to state your facts. I will listen better without the sun in my eyes." There was something in the way he said it that disarmed her by about 3 degrees, not enough to lower her guard, but enough to make her follow him inside, where Mrs. Garza appeared with a second cup of coffee that Naomi accepted mostly because her hands had been shaking slightly from the ride and from anger and from grief, and she needed something to hold. The main room of the Reed house was spare and functional, with a large table covered in maps and ledgers and the remnants of a working man's breakfast. Cornelius Reed cleared one end of the table with practiced efficiency and gestured for her to sit. She sat. He sat across from her. Neither of them touched their coffee. "Your water rights are valid," he said. Naomi blinked. She had prepared 7 different responses to 7 different objections, and this was not one of them. "I know that," she said after a beat. "The diversion was put in by my foreman without my authorization," Cornelius said. He rubbed the back of his neck in a way that communicated genuine discomfort. "He took it upon himself to redirect the upper run of Ridley Creek 3 weeks before I returned from Wichita. I have been dealing with the consequences ever since." "What consequences?" Naomi said. "My consequences are that my fields are dying. My wheat is half what it should be. My kitchen garden is nothing but cracked earth. I have a daughter and 200 acres and no water, Mr. Reed." He absorbed this without flinching. "I understand that, and I am sorry for it. The foreman has been dismissed. Dismissing him does not put the water back. No, it does not." He reached across the table and turned one of the maps toward her, a hand-drawn diagram of the creek system that was more detailed than her own surveyor's copy. "I want to show you something." Against every instinct that told her not to be interested in anything he showed her, she leaned in and looked. The map was good, better than good, actually. It showed the full watershed of Ridley Creek from its headwaters at the northern edge of the Reed property, all the way south, through the Dalton homestead and beyond. Someone had marked it carefully in 2 colors of ink, black for the natural course and red for the various diversions and channels that had been cut over the years. "The original diversion your father and mine agreed to in 1875 was here," Cornelius said, pointing with one finger. He had a small scar on the back of his right hand, Naomi noticed, old and silvered. "It allocated the spring flow equally. What my foreman built was here." He pointed to a different spot. "It cuts off everything before it reaches your boundary line." "I know where it is," Naomi said. "I walked the whole creek the morning I realized the flow had stopped. I went to see it with my own eyes." Cornelius looked at her then, a direct look, the kind that assessed rather than dismissed. "Of course you did," he said quietly, and it was not condescending, it was something closer to respect. "Then what is your proposed solution?" Naomi said. We tear out the new diversion and rebuild according to the 1875 agreement. I have the men and the equipment. We could do it in 2 days. And what is the guarantee that it stays in place? He was quiet for a moment. A written agreement. Something more formal than what our fathers had, witnessed and registered with the land office. Your foreman had access to whatever verbal or paper understandings existed before, Naomi pointed out. A registered document is meaningless if the man who employs the labor does not enforce it. I enforce my agreements, he said. I do not know that yet. The silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged, the way the air gets before a thunderstorm when the pressure is building and something has to give. What would convince you? Cornelius asked. And the question was so direct and so free of the usual masculine irritation she had encountered at every other stop along this journey, that for a moment she did not have an answer. She had spent 6 weeks being told that she was confused, that she was mistaken, that she should let a man handle it, that her late husband would have understood the situation differently. And here was a man asking her, genuinely, what it would take to earn her trust. She set her coffee cup down. "Show me the work," she said. "I want to be there when the diversion is removed. I want to see the water restored to its natural course with my own eyes. And then I want a formal agreement drafted by a proper lawyer, not just Gerald Oakes scribbling in a ledger." "There is a lawyer in Medicine Lodge," Cornelius said. "Ezra Bloom. He is thorough and honest, which is more than you can say for most." "I know Ezra Bloom. My father used him for the original homestead filing," she stood, which was her signal that the negotiation had reached its first natural pause. "When do you plan to begin the work?" Cornelius stood as well. "Tomorrow morning, if that suits you, dawn." "It suits me," she said. She picked up the surveyor's map from the table where she had spread it when she sat down. "I will be here at first light." "Mrs. Dalton," he said as she moved toward the door. She turned. "I am sorry about your husband. Thomas Dalton was a good man." He said it simply, without the excess of practiced condolence that she had grown to find suffocating. Just the plain truth, offered honestly. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "he was." She rode back to Caldwell Creek in the long light of late afternoon, and she was not sure what she felt. Not entirely satisfied, because satisfaction would have to wait until the water was actually flowing again. But something had shifted, some slight adjustment in the weight she had been carrying, and she was not sure what to make of that either. Her daughter Clara was staying with their neighbors, the Finch family, while Naomi dealt with the water business in town. Clara was a quiet, serious child with her father's patience and her mother's eyes, and she asked fewer questions than most 9-year-olds and understood more. Naomi had explained the situation to her in clear terms before leaving, because she believed in being clear with children about the realities of the world they were going to inherit. She collected Clara that evening from the Finch homestead, helped her up onto the back of the mare, and they rode home together in the fading light. "Did you fix it?" Clara asked against her mother's shoulder blade. "I have made a start," Naomi said. "We will see it done tomorrow." "Is the man terrible?" Naomi considered this honestly. "No," she said. "He is not terrible." Clara seemed to find this either interesting or sufficient, because she said nothing more until they reached home. The Dalton homestead was small by the standards of the territory. A 2-room frame house with a covered porch, a vegetable garden that was currently suffering, a small barn with 3 horses and a milk cow named Iris, and 200 acres of wheat and grazing land that stretched toward the southern horizon. Thomas had built the house with his own hands before they married, and every board of it was familiar to Naomi in the way that a person's own heartbeat is familiar. She loved it with a fierce and practical love that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with survival. She put Clara to bed and sat on the porch in the dark for a long time, listening to the dry wind moving through the grass and thinking about water and about men who said what they meant and what it meant that she was still thinking about the latter. She was at the Reed ranch at dawn, as promised. Cornelius Reed was already awake and already in the field, directing 4 ranch hands with shovels and a heavy iron pry bar toward the site of the illegal diversion. He looked up when he heard her horse and acknowledged her with a nod that was businesslike, and she thought, quietly relieved. She dismounted and walked to the edge of the creek bank to see for herself what had been done. The diversion was crude but effective. A packed earth dam reinforced with river rock, cutting off the eastern flow and redirecting it entirely onto Reed land. It had been built by someone who knew enough about hydrology to do it efficiently, and not enough about law or decency to know why he should not. The work of removing it took the better part of the morning. Naomi stood and watched, and occasionally she pointed out things that needed attention, a spot where the bank had been undercut, a place where the redirected flow had carved a new channel that would need to be filled and stabilized. The ranch hands, to their credit, listened to her without visible resentment. Cornelius Reed listened to her the same way he listened to his own men, with his full attention and without argument when she was right. By mid-morning, the dam was broken and the water was running in its original course. Naomi watched it come, a thin silver thread at first and then a proper flow, threading through the grass and moving south the way it was supposed to. She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tied. "It is working," she said. Cornelius came to stand beside her at the bank. He was muddy to the knee, and there was a smear of red earth along his jawline. He was looking at the water with an expression that was hard to read, but she thought it was something like genuine relief. "It is," he said. They stood there for a moment, which was perhaps longer than strictly necessary, watching the water run. Then one of the ranch hands called out from upstream, and the moment was over, and they both went back to the work of making sure the restoration was done properly. In the afternoon, Cornelius sent a rider to Medicine Lodge with a message for Ezra Bloom, requesting a formal water rights agreement to be drafted and registered. He did this while Naomi was still there, which she noted and appreciated. He was not going to wait until she left to see whether he would follow through. She was preparing to ride home when he said, "Stay for supper." She turned. He was leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed and that same direct, careful way of looking at her that she had noticed the day before. "That is not necessary," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not necessary. But Mrs. Garza has been cooking since noon, and she will be insulted if there is only me to eat it, and we still have things to discuss about the water agreement. Practical things. How the spring flow is allocated in dry years, what happens at the shared boundary line. It would be easier to talk over a meal than to ride back and forth for 3 more meetings. It was entirely reasonable. It was so reasonable that she could not find an objection that did not embarrass her, because the only objections that came to mind were not about the water agreement at all. "All right," she said. Supper was venison stew and cornbread, and something Mrs. Garza called a peach cobbler that was extraordinary. They ate at the big table with the map still spread at one end and talked about the creek. And somewhere between the stew and the cobbler, the conversation stopped being entirely about the creek. It shifted gradually, the way conversations do when 2 people are both intelligent and curious and have been too isolated for too long. They talked about the land, and then about the dry years of the late 1870s, and then about the railroad coming through the territory, and then about what that would mean for people like them, the smaller ranchers and homesteaders who were not company men and not speculators but simply people who had decided to stay. "You could sell," he said at one point. Not suggesting it exactly, but raising it as one of the things a person in her position might do. "I know," she said. "I will not." He looked at her. "Why not?" She thought about it honestly. "Because Thomas built that house," she said. "And because my daughter is going to grow up knowing that her mother did not give up the thing her father worked for. And because I am a better farmer than most of the men in this county, and the land knows it, even if they do not." There was a pause, and then Cornelius Reed said something she would think about for a long time afterward. "I believe you," he said, just that, plain and clear and entirely without qualification. She rode home in the early dark with Clara's little face in her mind, and the strange lightness of a day that had gone better than she had planned for in every direction. The following 2 weeks were occupied with the practical work of the water agreement. Ezra Bloom came up from Medicine Lodge, a small, precise man with a beard like Spanish moss, and he sat with both Naomi and Cornelius at the land office in Caldwell Creek and drafted an agreement that was the most thorough document Naomi had ever read. It covered the standard flow allocation, the dry year provisions, the boundary line responsibilities, the notification requirements if either party needed to modify anything, and a clause that made both of them sign individually that any future modifications required the written consent of both parties, no exceptions. Naomi read every word. She made 3 suggested changes. Ezra Bloom looked at her with the pleased surprise of a man who had not expected to be impressed and incorporated all 3. Cornelius did not argue with any of them. They signed in front of 2 witnesses, Gerald Oakes and a rancher named Mitchell who had come in for the day. The document was registered. It was done. Outside the land office in the sun and the dusty main street of Caldwell Creek, Cornelius Reed held out his hand. Naomi shook it. His grip was firm and brief and honest, and he held her eyes when he did it. "Thank you for being reasonable," she said. He almost smiled. "Thank you for being prepared. You knew more about water law than my lawyer." "I have had 6 weeks to become an expert," she said dryly. He did smile then fully for the first time, and she was entirely unprepared for what that did to the composition of the morning. She turned and walked to where her horse was tied before she could do something foolish, like smile back in a way that meant too much. But she did smile, a little, when she was turned away, and she was fairly sure he could not see it. She was wrong about that. There were things in the weeks that followed that she could not entirely explain by practicality. The first was a load of lumber that appeared at the Dalton homestead one morning without announcement. She came out at sunrise to find 3 men unloading good timber from a wagon, and when she demanded to know who had sent it, one of the men handed her a note in handwriting she had not seen before but recognized immediately as the product of someone who had learned to write in a hurry and never quite made it elegant. It said, "Your porch rail has been damaged since spring. This is pine from the mill in town. It is not charity. Add it to the account when the wheat comes in, or do not add it at all. Either way, your daughter should have a safe porch to stand on. C. Reed." She stood in the yard holding the note for longer than was strictly dignified. She put the lumber to use herself, with Clara handing her nails from a tin pail and watching with the focused interest of a child who understood that this was something important. The second thing was that Cornelius Reed began appearing at the Caldwell Creek General Store on the same mornings she came in for supplies, which she might have attributed to coincidence if it had happened twice. It happened 5 times in 3 weeks. He was not overt about it. He was not the kind of man who would simper or make scenes. He was the kind of man who found reasons to stand near the coffee counter when she was looking at flour prices, and who managed to carry her heavier purchases to her horse with the casualness of someone who simply happened to be going the same direction. She allowed this because she found she liked it, and because the alternative was to pretend she did not, which required more dishonesty than she was naturally capable of. The third thing was that he asked her opinion. Not about water rights, which would have been comprehensible. He asked her opinion about his wheat rotation, about the coming dry season, about whether the new strain of hard red winter wheat he had read about in an agricultural pamphlet from the Kansas State Board of Agriculture was worth the risk in their soil type. And she answered him honestly and with the accumulated knowledge of someone who had been farming this specific piece of earth for 7 years, and he listened in the way that very few people listen, with his full attention and a mind that was working on what she said rather than waiting for her to finish. It was that, more than anything else, that got to her. Not his face or the width of his shoulders or the way he moved through his land with the ease of a man who belonged to it. It was that he listened. One evening in late May, He rode over to the Dalton homestead on the pretense of checking the creek flow at the shared boundary, which was a reasonable thing to do after a dry week, but not at 6 in the evening when the light was going gold, and Clara had already been put to bed with a book. Naomi met him at the fence line with her arms crossed and her eyebrows raised in a way that communicated that she was fully aware of the pretense. He had the grace to look mildly abashed. "The creek is fine," she said. "I know," he said. They looked at each other across the fence for a moment. "You could come in," she said. "I have coffee on." He dismounted and looped his reins over the fence post and came around through the gate, and they sat on her porch, which now had a sound and sturdy rail in the cooling evening air, and they talked for 2 hours about everything except the obvious thing, which was that they had both stopped pretending this was only about water. When he finally stood to leave, hat in hand, he said, "I would like to take you to supper. Properly, in town, next Saturday if you are willing." Naomi looked up at him from her chair in the gathering dark. "That is a very direct way of asking something," she said. "I'm a direct kind of man," he said. "I find it saves time." "All right," she said. "Saturday." He put his hat on and walked to his horse with the careful evenness of a man trying not to let on how relieved he was. She watched him go and felt the warmth of the evening on her skin and something new beneath it that she had been careful not to name until now. She named it quietly to herself, sitting alone on her porch in the dark. She was not sure whether to be frightened of it or grateful for it. She settled pragmatically on grateful, because fear was something she had used up a great deal of in the past year, and she was running a conservation policy. Saturday in Caldwell Creek meant the hotel restaurant, which was the closest thing the town had to a proper dining room, with actual tablecloths that were mostly clean and a menu that ran to 3 choices, and a dessert that was either pie or pudding depending on the day. Cornelius Reed arrived at the Dalton homestead at 5 in the afternoon, in a clean shirt that he had clearly ironed himself, which touched her more than she wanted to admit, because the collar was not quite right, but the effort was unmistakable. He had shaved and cut his hair, at least approximately. Clara, who had been let in on the nature of the evening's engagement and had received it with the calm assessment of a very serious child, looked him over from the porch steps with an expression Naomi recognized as one she herself wore when forming an opinion she was not yet ready to share. "You are Mr. Reed," Clara said. "I am," he said. "You fixed our water." "I did. My mother knew what to do," Clara said. "She just needed you to agree." There was a pause, and then Cornelius Reed turned and looked at Naomi with something in his gray eyes that was helpless and delighted and undone. "She is completely right," he said. "She usually is," Naomi said, and handed Clara off to the Finch family for the evening. Supper at the hotel was good by the standards of the territory and better than good for the company. They talked easily, without the slight tension of their earlier meetings, as though something had been decided, and they were both free to simply be present in the fact of each other. He told her about growing up on this land, his father who had come from Ohio in 1868, and had worked himself into the ground to build what was now the Reed Ranch, his mother who had died when he was 19 and who had, he said, been the most formidable woman he had ever known before about 3 weeks ago. She laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that caught her by surprise. She told him about her own family, her father James Dalton, who had come to Kansas in 1871 as a freedman with $40, a mule, and a determination that had bordered on the supernatural, who had built the homestead from nothing and who now lived in Wichita with his second wife because his knees had given out and he could no longer ride the land himself. She told him about Thomas carefully, because Thomas deserved to be spoken of carefully, the good man he had been, the way he had made her laugh, and the way his absence was a specific shape in her days that had not closed over, only become something she worked around. She told him this honestly, without apology, because a man who could not hear the truth of a woman's full life was not the right man for any part of it. Cornelius listened to all of it. His hands were flat on the table. He did not fidget. He did not offer consolation at the wrong moments or try to pivot away from the harder parts. When she was done talking about Thomas, he said, "He sounds like someone worth missing." "He was," she said. "Thank you for saying it plainly." "I try," he said. After supper they walked down the main street in the warm night air, not touching but close enough that the distance between them was a decision rather than a gap. She was aware of the exact space between her shoulder and his arm. "I want to be honest about something," he said, when they had reached the end of the street where it dissolved into the open dark of the plains. "Good," she said. "I did not come to the land office that first day to argue with you. Gerald had already told me about the situation the week before. I knew you were right. I had already told my lawyer that the diversion had to come out." She looked at him. "Then why did you not fix it before I arrived?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I did not know how to introduce myself," he said, "and I needed a reason to meet you." The honesty of it was so complete and so unexpectedly vulnerable that it stopped her still on the street, and she looked at him in the darkness with the stars doing whatever they always did over Kansas and felt something shift in the deep architecture of herself. "That," she said, "is quite possibly the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard." "I know," he said, with great seriousness. "You let my fields dry up for 3 additional weeks so that you would have a reason to meet me." "When you say it like that, it sounds considerably worse," he acknowledged. "It is considerably worse. I know that too." She looked at him for another long moment and then she started laughing, and once she started she could not stop for an embarrassingly long time, and he laughed too, a low sound that she felt in her chest, and they stood there on the edge of Caldwell Creek in the dark and laughed until the tension of the whole preceding spring had burned itself away. "You are going to owe me several barrels of water for that," she said finally. "Whatever you need," he said. She looked at him again, and this time the laughter was quieter but still there, underlying everything, and she thought that this was perhaps the best kind of trouble to be in. He took her home. At her gate, under the enormous Kansas sky, he held out his hand the way he had outside the land office, except this time when she put her hand in his, he did not shake it. He held it for a moment very carefully and looked at her. "May I call on you again?" he asked. "You may," she said. He let go of her hand, replaced his hat, and rode south into the dark. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while, listening to the night and the way her own heartbeat had changed its ordinary rhythm. Summer came to the Kansas plains in a wave of heat that turned the horizon to water and the nights to a merciful blue-black cool. The wheat grew. The creek ran steadily through both properties, the way it was supposed to, the way the agreement said it must. Naomi's fields recovered with a resilience that she had always believed in and that the summer proved right. Cornelius called on her regularly, every Saturday and often midweek as well when some legitimate purpose could be found, and sometimes when no purpose was needed beyond the fact of arriving and being welcomed in. He became, gradually and then entirely, part of the rhythm of her days in the way that only certain people manage to become. He repaired her barn roof after a June storm without being asked, and without making it into a performance of generosity. He brought Clara a book about horses from the bookshop in Medicine Lodge, a real bookshop, which meant he had gone specifically to the bookshop, and looked for something she would like, which Clara received with the restrained delight of a child determined to maintain her composure, and then immediately disappeared with for 2 hours. One afternoon in July, when the heat was extraordinary and they had both given up trying to do anything productive, they sat on the porch of the Dalton homestead in the hot shade, and he told her about the years after his mother died, the way the ranch had nearly failed, the 2 winters he had worked himself to the edge of his health keeping it together, the bank man from Wichita who had come twice to threaten foreclosure and twice been met with the exact payment required, down to the last dollar. "How did you do it?" she asked. "I was stubborn," he said, "and I had good hands, good men who stayed when they did not have to." He paused, "and I sold my mother's piano." "That must have been a hard thing." "It was the hardest," he said quietly. She played it every Sunday evening. The sound of it was the sound of the whole house. Naomi looked at her own hands for a moment. When Thomas died, she said, I could not make myself move anything of his for 2 months. His boots were by the door for 2 months. He did not say anything, just turned to look at her with the full weight of his attention. Clara moved them, Naomi said. She put them in the closet one morning, and when I asked her about it later, she said, Papa would not want us to be tripping over them. Cornelius made a sound that was not quite a laugh but held the quality of one. Smart girl. Terrifyingly so, Naomi agreed. The afternoon wore on. The heat did not break. Neither of them moved to leave. He reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his, not tentatively but with the quiet certainty of someone who had been working up to an honest thing and was done waiting to do it. She turned her hand over under his and held on. I am not going to pretend, he said, that I know how to do this properly. I have not been in the habit of it. Neither have I, she said. Not again, not after Thomas. I know, he said. I am not asking you to forget anything or replace anything. I am asking you to let me be something that is its own thing, something new. She looked out at the summer fields, at the green wheat moving in the hot wind, at the sky that was white with heat and enormous. I think, she said carefully, that you already are. His hand tightened on hers briefly, and then they sat in the good silence of two people who have said an honest thing and do not need to add to it. August brought a new complication in the form of a man named Harlan Price. Price was a land speculator from Kansas City who had been buying up homesteads along the Chicaskia Basin for the past year, acquiring properties by various means, some of them entirely legitimate and some of them considerably less so. He had gotten 3 properties to the north of the creek system, and he had his eye on 2 more, the Dalton homestead and the Reed ranch. He appeared at the Dalton homestead one morning while Naomi was mending fence at the east boundary. He came in a very clean black buggy with 2 riders alongside him, which was the kind of arrival designed to make an impression, and he was the kind of man who dressed for effect, a well-cut suit, a watch chain, the specific smile of someone who had practiced making it look warm. Mrs. Dalton, he said, stepping down from the buggy with the ease of a man who expected women alone on homesteads to be relieved by the arrival of male assistants. Harlan Price. I represent the Western Land and Development Company. I know who you are, Naomi said. She did not put down the fence pliers. He smiled the warm smile. Then you know I am here to make you a very good offer. I am not selling, she said. You have not heard the number. The number does not matter, she said. I am not selling. Price's smile shifted slightly, the way a mask shifts when the person wearing it makes a wrong move. Mrs. Dalton, you are a widow farming alone with a child. The dry years are coming. The railroad extension is going to bypass this county entirely, and the land values are only going to go in one direction. Thank you for the agricultural forecast, Naomi said. I am not selling. He looked at her for a long moment with the eyes of a man recalibrating. I will come back when you have had time to think it over. There is no amount of time that changes my answer, she said. Good morning, Mr. Price. He left, but she did not think he was done. Men like Harlan Price did not take first refusals as final answers. She rode to the Reed ranch that afternoon and found Cornelius in the barn going over a saddle with an awl. She told him about Price. He set the awl down and listened without interrupting, his jaw going tighter as she talked. He came to me last week, he said when she was finished. Made me a similar offer. What did you tell him? That I was not interested. He called my price and I called him something that Mrs. Garza would not approve of. He will try again, Naomi said, and he will try differently. Men like him do not use the same method twice when the first one does not work. Cornelius looked at her. What are you thinking? I am thinking that 2 properties with a formal, registered water-sharing agreement are considerably more difficult to acquire than 2 individual holdings. He cannot buy the water rights separately from the land, and he cannot control the watershed if he only owns one side of it. Cornelius was very still for a moment. You want to make the agreement stronger. I want to make it unbreakable, she said. legally and practically. There should be no version of this where a speculator with money can sever our arrangement and use one property to undercut the other. They went back to Ezra Bloom in Medicine Lodge the following week and added an addendum to the water agreement that made any transfer of either property contingent on the continuation of the existing water rights arrangement, which effectively made the properties interdependent from a legal standpoint. Price could not buy one without the encumbrance of the other's water rights, which made both properties far less attractive to a speculator looking for a clean acquisition. Bloom reviewed the addendum and said, "This is either very clever or a great nuisance depending on which side of it you stand." "We are aware," Naomi said. On the ride back from Medicine Lodge, their horses walking easy in the evening cool, Cornelius was quiet for a long stretch of miles. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He rode for another half-mile before he answered. "I am thinking," he said slowly, "that there is a more straightforward way to make our properties legally interdependent." She was quiet, looking between her horse's ears at the long road home. "I am thinking," he continued, "that I have been trying to find the right moment to say something for the past 6 weeks and that I have probably been overthinking it, which is a habit of mine." "It is," she confirmed. He turned to look at her from horseback, which is a slightly awkward angle for the kind of seriousness he was attempting, and the awareness of this apparently struck him as well because he pulled his horse to a stop and waited for her to do the same. And when they were both still in the middle of the road with the plain stretching out around them in every direction and the first stars just beginning to appear, he said, "Naomi, I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I am asking you to marry me." She looked at him for a long moment in the gathering dark. The stars were very bright. The grass moved. A nighthawk called somewhere to the south. "You know this is not a solution to the price problem," she said. "I know that," he said. "The price problem is a separate matter. This is not about land. This is about the fact that I am better at every single thing I do when you are part of my day, and I want you to be part of every day." She breathed in slowly, feeling the cool evening air, feeling the shape of her own life and how it had arrived at this particular road in this particular light. "You understand," she said, "that I am not simple. That I come with opinions and a daughter and a homestead and 200 acres of wheat that I will not be parted from. I am counting on all of it," he said. "You understand that I will dispute you loudly when I believe you are wrong. I would expect nothing less," he said. "You have been right every time so far." "I have," she agreed. She looked at him in the starlight, this man who had listened when no one else did, who had fixed what was broken without being asked to be thanked for it, who had made her laugh in the dark on the edge of a Kansas town and told her the truth about why. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for some time. "Thank God," he said. She laughed and he crossed the short distance between their horses and took her hand, and this time the holding of it was not tentative at all. Clara received the news the following morning over breakfast with the focused consideration she brought to all important information. "Are you keeping the homestead?" was her first question. "Yes," Naomi said. "Are we moving to Mr. Reed's ranch?" "We would live at the ranch and the homestead would continue to operate. We would not lose either one." Clara appeared to process this. "Will you still be in charge of the water?" "We will both be in charge of the water," Naomi said. "But you will still be the one who actually knows what you are doing." There was a pause. "Clara," Naomi said carefully. "I'm just asking the practical questions," Clara said serenely. Cornelius, who had been invited for breakfast specifically for the occasion of this conversation, managed to keep his expression under control by some considerable effort. "She is correct," he said. "Your mother knows more about water management than I do, and I will defer to her expertise." Clara looked at him for a long moment and then, apparently, decided something. "All right," she said, and went back to her eggs. Naomi caught Cornelius's eye over their daughter's head and saw the warmth in his face, the real, unguarded warmth of a man who had just decided he was going to love this child without reservation, and she felt the last of her careful holding back dissolve like creek ice in April. Harlan Price made one more attempt in September, 3 weeks before the wedding. He came to the land office with a lawyer of his own, a slick man from Kansas City, and presented a new offer along with what he claimed was evidence of a discrepancy in the original Dalton homestead filing. He was suggesting, with the polished vagueness of men who deal in legal pressure, that there might be a question about whether the 1877 water rights filing had been properly completed under James Dalton's name versus Thomas Dalton's, and whether that created a gap in the legal chain that his client might find interesting. Naomi, who had been at the land office for an entirely unrelated reason and walked in on the tail end of this presentation, listened to the whole thing from the doorway. She set her basket down on Gerald Oak's desk. The 1877 filing was made jointly by James Dalton as the original homestead claimant and Thomas Dalton as the resident farmer under the provisions of the Homestead Act, with Thomas's name as the primary water rights holder by mutual agreement of both parties, witnessed and notarized by this office on March 3, 1877. The notarization stamp is on page 4. The witness was your predecessor, Mr. Oakes, a man named Howard Bell, who I believe is currently retired in Lawrence. I have his address if your lawyer needs to verify. She looked at Price's lawyer. If you would like to pursue a legal challenge to a properly filed, witnessed, and notarized document, I would suggest you consult Ezra Bloom in Medicine Lodge before you spend your client's money on something that will not hold. There was a silence. Price looked at her with an expression that had finally abandoned all pretense of warmth. I will not be selling, she said, and neither will Mr. Reed. We would appreciate it if your visits to this county came to an end. Price left Caldwell Creek 2 days later. He did not come back. Gerald Oakes told the story to everyone he knew for 6 months. The wedding took place on an October morning when the Kansas sky was the clear, hard blue of the best days and the air had the edge of autumn in it, cool and honest. Naomi wore a dress the color of autumn grass, not white because she was a practical woman and white was impractical, but with lace at the collar that her mother had sent from Wichita along with a letter that was 3 pages long and contained 1 line of concern about the speed of things and 2.5 pages of happiness. The ceremony was held at the Calvary Methodist Church in Caldwell Creek, which was small enough that it was mostly full with 50 people. James Dalton was there, having made the journey from Wichita with his wife Martha despite his bad knees and their protests that it was too far, because it was not, he had said, too far for this. He stood up straight during the ceremony with the particular dignity of a man who had built something out of nothing and was watching the continuation of it. And when he shook Cornelius Reed's hand afterward, he held it for a long time and looked at him with eyes that said everything that needed to be said. Clara stood beside her mother in a dress that matched the lace at the collar, holding a small bouquet of autumn wildflowers she had gathered herself. She did not cry. She watched the proceedings with the grave attention she brought to important things, and when the minister asked if anyone had reason to object, she looked around the room with an expression that suggested she would be very interested to hear from anyone who tried, which made the front row suppress their laughter with varying degrees of success. When it was done, when Cornelius turned to her in the clear October light, and she saw his face, stripped of everything except the truth of the moment, she knew she had made the right thing. Not the easy thing and not the expected thing, and not the thing she had planned for when she rolled up that surveyor's map and rode 30 miles in fury to dispute a water right. Something considerably more binding than a water agreement. Something that was going to grow like wheat in good soil, requiring work and attention, and the willingness to go out in the difficult seasons and stay anyway. He kissed her in the church in front of 50 people and her father and her daughter and God and the October sky visible through the window, and she kissed him back with everything she had. The reception was held outside on the grounds of the Reed Ranch, which now had a painted fence and Mrs. Garza's extraordinary cooking spread across 4 long tables. There was music from a fiddle player named Amos who could play reels until midnight without repeating himself, and several of the ranchers' wives who had privately told each other all summer that they were very glad someone had finally sorted out the water situation, because Mrs. Dalton was the most sensible person in 3 counties, and it was about time. James Dalton danced with his new daughter-in-law in the afternoon light, moving carefully on his troubled knees, and told her that Thomas would have been glad. "I know," she said, and meant it. Clara danced with an 8-year-old boy named Peter Finch, who was red-faced and clearly terrified, which she endured with the patience of someone who had agreed to one dance as a courtesy, and intended to stick to the agreement. Cornelius danced with his wife in the late afternoon when the light was going copper, and the fiddle was playing something slow and sweet, and he held her with the care of someone handling something precious, that is also, definitively, not fragile, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and felt the sound of the music in his chest, and thought about how strange and how right it was to have come here for a water dispute. They settled into their life the way good things settle, not all at once but building steadily, each layer adding to the one before. The 2 properties were managed together and separately in the sensible way that Naomi organized, with the homestead running as its own operation, its fields tended by a hired hand named Garrett who was young and reliable, and the accounts kept by Naomi who had a better head for numbers than anyone on either property. The Reed Ranch expanded its wheat operation using the rotation schedule Naomi had described over that first dinner, and the yields in the following year were the best in Cornelius's memory. Ezra Bloom commented, on his next visit to review the annual land filings, that the Dalton-Reed water agreement had become something of a model in the county, with other neighboring properties now drafting similar documents to resolve disputes that had been festering for years. He said this with the pleased look of a man whose good work had propagated itself. Naomi said she was glad of it. Clara, who had been given her own section of the kitchen garden to manage the first spring after the marriage, took to it with a focus that would have frightened anyone who did not know her. By midsummer she was producing more tomatoes than the household could eat, which she sold with considerable satisfaction to the general store. She kept her own ledger. "She is going to be a land agent," Cornelius said one evening, watching Clara calculating something in her ledger at the kitchen table with the intense concentration of someone doing important work. "She is going to be whatever she decides," Naomi said. He put his arm around her shoulders at the kitchen table, and she leaned into him in the natural, unself-conscious way that had developed over the months, the ease of 2 people who have decided that being close is the ordinary state of things. Winter came, the first winter of their marriage, with the particular intimacy of closed-in days and firelight, and the work of keeping a household warm and fed. Cornelius chopped wood in quantities that suggested a man with something to prove, which Naomi found endearing enough to say nothing about. She baked in the winter mornings and taught Clara to bake alongside her, passing down the recipes that her own mother had passed down, adjusting quantities and methods for the Kansas altitude and the particular temperament of the cast-iron stove. She found that she was happy. Not the simple happiness of youth or the uncomplicated happiness of someone for whom nothing had ever gone wrong, but the deep, tested happiness of a woman who had been through the worst kind of loss and found, on the other side of it, that the world still had this kind of morning in it. Fire in the grate, flour on her hands, her daughter's voice asking questions from the table, her husband's boots on the porch before he came in out of the cold. In the second spring of their marriage, she told Cornelius that she was expecting a child. He was in the barn at the time, checking on one of the mares who had been off her feed. She came to stand in the barn door and told him directly, which was her way. He turned from the horse and looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen before, or rather, she had seen parts of it separately but not assembled in this particular combination. the disbelief and the joy and the immediate, instinctive worry that came with both, and underneath all of it the pure, wide-open love of a man who had not expected to have this much. He crossed the barn in 4 steps and put his arms around her, very carefully, as though she might break, which she immediately corrected by hugging him back with considerably more force. "I am not made of china," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I know that," but he did not let go for a long time. Clara's reaction, delivered over supper when they told her, was typically her own. "Is it going to be loud?" she asked. "Babies generally are," Naomi confirmed. Clara considered this. "I suppose that is all right. I will teach it things when it gets older." "That is very generous," Cornelius said with perfect seriousness. "Someone has to," Clara said reasonably, and returned to her supper. The summer was good and warm, and the wheat was extraordinary. The second year of the new rotation proving out everything the agricultural pamphlet had promised and more. The creek ran clean and steady through both properties, the way the agreement said it must, the way it had for 2 years without incident or dispute. The water was the backbone of everything, the quiet foundation that made the rest possible. Naomi spent the late summer months doing rather less riding than she was accustomed to, which she found irritating. But she managed the homestead accounts, and the planning for the following year, and the correspondence with her father in Wichita, and a new correspondence she had begun with the Kansas Board of Agriculture about water rights documentation for small homesteaders, because she had noticed, in her own experience, how many disputes arose from inadequate original filings, and she thought something should be done about it. The letter she sent to the Board of Agriculture proposing a standardized water rights document process for homestead filings was acknowledged 3 months later with a polite response, indicating that her suggestions had been noted by the relevant committee. A year after that, the standardized process she had proposed was adopted. She filed this information away with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned not to need the credit, only the result. Their son was born on a November morning in 1883, delivered by the capable hands of Dr. Eleanor Marsh, who had come from Medicine Lodge 6 months earlier and was slowly, with great determination, convincing the county that a woman doctor was not something to be alarmed about. The birth was long and not easy, but Naomi had never expected anything good to arrive without difficulty, and she met it the way she met everything, with concentration and endurance. Cornelius, who had been confined to the kitchen by Dr. Marsh on the grounds that husbands in the room were more hindrance than help, wore a path in the kitchen floor that Mrs. Garza later measured at approximately 4 miles. When he was allowed in, finally, to see his wife and his son in the gray November morning light, he stood at the bedside and looked at both of them with an expression that did not try to be anything other than what it was. Naomi was tired in a way that went below the bones, but she was also, unmistakably, fine. She was holding their son with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this before, and the baby, who was dark-haired and clearly opinionated already about whatever he thought of the November air, was remarkably solid. "Come sit down," she said. "You look terrible." "I have been walking," he said. "I know, I could hear you." She shifted slightly to make room on the edge of the bed. He sat carefully, and she put their son in his arms and watched his face. He was completely still for a moment, this man who had plowed fields in frozen ground and worked through 2 brutal winters and sold his mother's piano to keep the land. And then something in his expression went very quiet and very certain, the way a man looks when he has finally arrived at the thing he has been traveling toward. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. The baby made a sound of supreme disinterest. "He has your opinions already," Cornelius said. "He has your lungs," Naomi said. They named him James, for her father, which was the obvious choice and the right one. And James Dalton Reed, when informed of his namesake via letter, wrote back a reply that was so full of feeling that the handwriting was difficult to read in several places. Clara, at 10 years old, appointed herself the baby's primary educator with the same focused authority she brought to her kitchen garden and her ledger. And James, who was an equable baby for all his strong opinions, appeared to find her completely acceptable. The years that followed built on each other the way good years do, not without difficulty, because the land always had difficulty in it. A late frost that took half the wheat one April, a summer that was too dry the following year, the constant negotiation of running two properties and a household and raising children who were growing at a pace that seemed designed specifically to surprise you. Through all of it, the water ran. The creek that had brought Naomi Dalton riding in fury down the long road to Cornelius Reed's door continued to run through both their properties according to the agreement that they had made, the real agreement and the one that followed it. In dry years they managed it together carefully, with the shared knowledge of two people who had learned that water was not something you hoarded but something you stewarded, and that the stewardship was better done in partnership than alone. Their second child came 4 years after James, a daughter they named Elena, for Dr. Marsh, who had become a genuine friend in the years since the birth, and who received the honor with the slightly flustered pleasure of a woman not accustomed to being recognized. Elena was from the first moment lighter of spirit than James, easier to laugh, possessing her grandfather's gift for easy warmth and her mother's absolute precision about everything she decided to care about. James grew into a serious, capable boy who wanted to learn everything about the land with the same appetite his parents both had. Clara, by the time she was 16, had parlayed her kitchen garden accounts into a small business selling produce and seeds to 3 other families in the county, and was writing letters to her grandfather in Wichita about the possibility of attending the state normal school, because someone needed to be educated in the family, and Clara had decided it should be her. James Dalton came to visit in the summer of 1888, his bad knees managed by a cane, and his presence enormous in the way of certain men who have built something lasting. He sat on the porch of the Reed Ranch and watched his grandson run through the wheat rows and his granddaughter chase a chicken around the yard and his daughter sitting in the shade with her husband and their coffee, talking in the easy way of people who have been through enough together to have shed all pretense. "Thomas would be proud," he said to Naomi when they were alone for a moment. "I know," she said. "I know that too. Are you happy, girl?" She looked out over the land at Cornelius moving across the yard toward the barn with young James at his heels, at Elena finally catching the chicken with a crow of triumph, at the wheat in the long summer light at the creek she could not see from here but knew was running steady and clean through the eastern boundary. "Yes," she said, "I am." He nodded and looked out at the same view and was quiet for a while. "The water trouble," he said eventually. "Was that how you met him?" "It was," she said. James Dalton made a sound that was difficult to categorize, but held within it considerable satisfaction. "Your mother always said," he said, "that your father never did anything the easy way." "Clara said the same thing about me," Naomi said. "Clara," her father said, "is going to run the state before she is 40. "I am aware," Naomi said. Cornelius came back from the barn and settled into the chair beside her and refilled his coffee from the pot. Mrs. Garza had left on the rail, and James Dalton looked at him with the particular look of a man who has been satisfied by what he has seen and does not need to say so in words. That evening, after James Dalton had been seen to bed and the children were down and the house was quiet, Naomi and Cornelius sat on the porch in the summer dark with the nighthawks calling and the stars doing what they always did over Kansas, which was everything at once and more of it than anywhere else. "Tell me what you are thinking," he said. He always asked, and she always told him, which was perhaps the defining habit of their life together. "I am thinking," she said, "about the first morning I rode up your drive with my surveyor's map and my argument all prepared. I remember watching you come," he said. "I was looking out the window. I thought, here comes trouble." "You were right," she said. "The best kind," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the dark. He put his arm around her and held her in the easy, warm certainty of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that it is exactly right. The creek ran on. The land continued. The agreement held, as good agreements do, not because it was forced to, but because the people who made it had decided, in writing and in everything that followed, that the thing they were building together was worth more than anything they could have built apart. Somewhere in the sequence of events that had begun with a woman riding in fury to dispute a water right, there had been a moment, perhaps in a land office, perhaps on a porch in the evening, perhaps in the middle of a road between Medicine Lodge and Caldwell Creek with the stars coming out, where the nature of the binding had changed. Not the legal document, not the formal agreement that Ezra Bloom had so carefully crafted and that was sitting in the records of the Caldwell Creek Land Office, properly notarized and witnessed and registered. The other one, the considerably more binding one, the one that ran, like water, through everything. Clara left for the State Normal School in Emporia in the fall of 1889, which she had arranged with her grandfather's help and her own savings, and the particular force of will that had always been the defining feature of her character. She left on a September morning with a trunk and 2 cases, and an expression of composed excitement that she maintained all the way to the wagon, and then she turned and hugged her mother with her whole heart for a long, wordless moment before she climbed up and squared her shoulders and faced the road. Naomi stood in the yard and watched the wagon go until it was a small shape on the long Kansas road, and then smaller and then gone. Cornelius came to stand beside her. "She is going to be extraordinary," he said. "She already is," Naomi said. He put his hand in hers. She held it. Behind them, young James was loudly arguing with a leaner about something involving a fence post and a bucket of paint, and Mrs. Garza was calling from the kitchen window that breakfast was going to get cold if they did not come inside. The October sky was the clear, hard blue of the best days. The water ran. Naomi Dalton Reed stood on the land she had refused to give up, next to the man who had listened when she needed to be heard, and breathed in the morning air that smelled of dust and wheat and the coming autumn. She had come to dispute a water right. She had stayed for everything else, and everything else, it turned out, was more than enough.